Hey, good morning, Rob Laurie. How are you?
Good.
Well, today is Sunday, September the 13th, 2020, and we are starting a new tradition here at TheraCann. We will be using each week to load up a new podcast that will cover a variety of different topics that are part of what we call the Theraverse, the TheraCann universe, based on our subject matter experts who truly do have unique knowledge, training, and technical skill in the many topics in which we'll be discussing over the course of the remainder of this year. Today's topic, before we do introductions, is entheogens. What are they? What do they mean for us? And more importantly, what do we see both as opportunities, both domestically and internationally, and how might we be able to contribute to that? But first, by way of introduction, my name is Chris Bolton. I'm the CEO of TheraCann International, and I have the pleasure of having with me in Canada, not in Panama, Rob Laurie, who will introduce himself now. Go ahead, Rob.
Good morning. Thank you, Chris. My name is Robert Laurie. I am Senior Advisor to TheraCann International Benchmark Corporation, which of course is a leading full turnkey solution and critical infrastructure provider for the regulated food, cannabis, and psychedelic industries. I'm also a practicing lawyer with international credentials. I'm qualified in England and called to the bar in British Columbia. And I have my legal practice at Lucent Law Corporation, which focuses on corporate, commercial, business, government, regulatory issues, and charter legalities surrounding cannabis, psychedelic, and within that, entheogenic plant medicines.
Well, thanks, Rob. And for today's podcast, we thought we'd kick it off because this is obviously a very hot topic. And I'm hearing the term frequently now in conference calls around the planet. What are entheogens and why are they important?
Right. Well, entheogens are effectively a subset of psychedelics. I mean, before we jump into entheogens, effectively you've got what are known as the traditional classic psychedelics, which include mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. Right. Most of the psychedelics are Schedule 3. Some are Schedule 1. But an entheogen specifically is a psychoactive substance that induces alterations in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, or behavior for the purposes of effectively finding the spirit or the God or the God source within. And it's actually quite impactful because they talk about in psychedelic therapy the mystic experience, and entheogens are traditionally effectively useful for in therapy for realizing the change within and the realization of oneness within within the universe.
Fair enough. So they've often equated that with a religious experience, but also on the medical side, medical research and development, we're seeing rewiring of critical structures of the brain, sometimes repairing damage, other times changing perception to deal with trauma. And what's been interesting from all that we've read, of course, is the ability to have the brain's capacity to change last longer than a few hours. In many cases, months, even up to half a year. So obviously a highly relevant topic for any of those that are suffering high stress and trauma through COVID. We have spoken with quite a number of governments around the planet that see a pending wave of patients that are going to require some management with regards to anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and of course PTSD as a result of all of this. So very, very timely. But Rob, I'm having my cup of morning coffee, which for me is something that is a need to have. I didn't start drinking till the last year of my law school, but can't do without, and travel the planet with my mug, my special mug that everybody knows, to get my caffeine. Is coffee based in that camp? Is it an entheogen?
Not traditionally, but interestingly enough, coffee or caffeine is a central nervous system or CNS stimulant. And the irony is that we see coffee everywhere, coffee dispensaries, Starbucks. And in fact, if you were to compare coffee or caffeine with nicotine, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, and cannabis, well, interestingly, with cannabis, you see like that there's actually a much higher tolerance can be developed with caffeine.
Right.
The intoxication is actually higher in cannabis, but the withdrawal symptoms are greater in coffee, and the dependence actually can be developed is greater in caffeine than cannabis. And this was the Henningfield study as part of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So again, coffee is a drug. Whether or not it is an entheogen is another thing, but the coffee itself is used in other Amazonian plant medicines. There are certain brands of or types of hape, which is a snuff, which has predominantly tobacco in it, and other substances. But coffee could certainly be used in combination with other substances for the creation of an entheogenic experience.
Right, right. Well, and oddly enough, as you say, coffee, certainly in Canada, is dispensed by the brand Tim Hortons. Depending on the province, can be found on just about every block. I remember in Halifax looking down the street and counting no less than 14 of the Tim Hortons stores, and that's only because that's as far as I could see. I'm sure there were more.
Well, the irony in Vancouver during 2015, which was the dispensary, the city, it was the year the city addressed the dispensary boom. And I mean, at that time you had 100+ unlicensed, technically illegal dispensaries operating within the city of Vancouver. And at one point it was said there were more dispensaries in Vancouver than there were Starbucks. And I never necessarily considered that a bad thing.
Right, right. Well, it brings us to our next discussion point, which, we've chatted about this back and forth for the last number of months, is the advancement now of changes in regulation, either decriminalizing the use thereof of entheogens. There are those that are not part of the schedules, and there are those that are not part of the UN Convention. But nonetheless, we're seeing a lot of change. And the thin edge of the wedge, which you've been involved in, was assisting those first 4 patients in Canada to get a first in 50-year exemption to use psilocybin. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, that was the TheraCAST initiative, which was led by Dr. Bruce Tobin and the members of the TheraCAST Coalition. I was a member of the litigation team, the TheraCAST litigation team led by Paul Lewin. And yes, on August 4th, after awaiting 100 days, the health minister, Patty Hajdu, granted the Section 56 exemptions, allowing for terminally ill patients to use or utilize psilocybin as a therapeutic treatment under the supervision of an attending doctor, which in this case is Dr. Bruce Tobin, who's a psychologist. The interesting thing in all of this is that initially these 4 patients, Section 56 was rejected by the ministry, or the minister, which led to the creation of the TheraCAST litigation team, as we were brought in to challenge the rejection and bring a judicial review. And the reason that initially that the minister rejected the application had nothing to do with Section 56. It had everything to do with the Food and Drug Regulations at Schedule C 810 subsection 1, which ultimately a minister may issue a letter of authorization for the sale of a drug for use in the emergency treatment of a patient under care of that practitioner. However, at Schedule C 810 1.1, the minister shall not issue a letter of authorization under subsection 1 for a new drug if that drug contains a restricted drug as defined in Section J1 001. And effectively, that's Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations, which effectively regulates and restricts the use of quote unquote restricted drugs, of which psilocybin and psilocin are still on the books as such in Canada. And accordingly, they can only be used for scientific and research purposes. That was the case up until August the 4th. Right. The minister, despite these restrictions I just quoted to you, Chris, still stand. The minister did not amend or vary these through an order of council, but went ahead and despite the rejection or the Section 56 rejection, she went ahead, I guess, and recanted and is now allowed access for these 4 patients, which brings us to an interesting dilemma. Yes. The minister, in granting these exemptions, is effectively allowing the possession, transport, the destruction, and the processing, which I interpret to be effectively grinding and mixing before consumption. Nowhere in there is there any provision for the production or guidance on where to source these medicines. Right. So ultimately, the minister, in her wisdom of granting the exemptions without declaring addressing the issue of a safe, legal, traceable, trackable product, which effectively medical patients and anybody else can use without fear of product liability concerns or issues involving possession. And at present, it is really uncertain as to where and how these patients should be sourcing cannabis, or excuse me, psilocybin. And at the end of this, do you really want terminally ill and immunocompromised medical patients accessing an unregulated product from the black market, which is really hit and miss?
Well, it's more complicated than that, right? We
of course,
as many of our clients know, work directly with governments around the world in building robust frameworks that don't create those paradoxes, right? In being able to plan forward to be able to ensure that the industry is fully transparent, it's visible, we have repeatability of product, we have full traceability, and we have, more importantly, full record keeping, not just to meet the regulatory requirement, but to allow for banking.
Compliance.
And so, you know, behind me here is a picture of our Center of Excellence in Panama Pacifico. For the better part of a year, we have worked to put in a legal framework in Panama that allows the country to obviously still manage what will be medical cannabis, but then extend it to other sources, other plants using the same framework. In Canada, we've gone through how many pieces of legislation? MMER, MMPR, ACMPR, and now the Cannabis Act. Are we going to now have to have a psilocybin act, an ayahuasca act, a peyote act? I mean, how do you see the government of Canada, which many countries around the world still see as being the go-to solve these problems in a way that is actually effective and optimal? How do you see that progressing, Rob?
Well, it's a very good question, and Canada has been sought out by other countries and governments at the federal and state levels who are interested to see how we've been able to tackle, or how we've tackled some of these larger issues. And it's interesting because although we're the first G7 country to produce and cultivate and deal with cannabis, there's been a lot of knock-on effects and inconsistencies that haven't been ironed out. Most importantly, what we're doing in Canada is still technically illegal under the international law. There hasn't been any amendments, and at the moment we see a lot of this as, well, what we're doing is being tolerated due to the fact that Canada did take some steps and to address issues like feedstock and traceable supply and compliance, and effectively being able to trace from seed through to sale a product, which ultimately is keeping the banks happy. But I think the banks and the auditors would be a lot happier if the international rules and conventions were amended and updated accordingly. Because we have to not lose track of the reality that in, you know, these substances from LSD to psilocybin, even, I mean, mescaline, I mean, these were in full study up through the 50s. In fact, Canada was a real leader with Humphrey Osmond and other pioneers studying effectively LSD on, you know, alcohol and smoking cessation.
Well, I
And
remember
ironically,
that.
Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, attributes his acid trip out of that breakthrough experience. So ultimately, these rules and laws that were brought in at the international level were brought in by the United States, predominantly the Nixon administration, with an agenda that has proven to be completely baseless with respect to scientific and medical research, and had more to do with suppressing the counterculture and vehement opposition to the Vietnam War. So where does that leave us? This leaves us in,
well, that's just
go ahead.
it. Like when I prosecuted drugs, which, as you know, we called it then marijuana because that's the way it was written into the Narcotic Control Act. And now that's been thankfully modified back to cannabis. And then, of course, all other controlled substances were all lumped into the same bucket. And, you know, when I was called on, as I was being challenged on my belief set that we were wasting a lot of taxpayer dollars for a whole category of people who were simply trying to medicate themselves, you know, it was through my research, this was back in 1990, 1991, a long time ago, where it was clear that a lot of what had been passed was baseless. And here we are some 30 years later, still fighting this, and there is no consensus in policy development. And that's something that we're doing, starting with those countries that are catching up to, you know, the other 50 countries of the world that have legislated cannabis in some shape or fashion, is put in a framework that's adaptable to include other plants that do require plant medicines, for example, that require some form of traceability, quality control, record keeping, to keep everybody in line. And that's not so bad. But Rob, you know, even with what we're talking about today, let's zero in on mushrooms, and let's use ayahuasca, because between the two, that's primarily the in cannabis, of course, are the three main plants that most people still consider North, Central, and South America as being the primary medicines. There are others, of course, but how would you see that forming up into a single framework? How do you see that moving forward, and how do the average individual who, in most countries, if they're native, still have very much a right as an indigenous people to consume these without any regulations at all? So how do you see that kind of coming together?
Okay, a lot of good points in there. I'll try to break it up. So dealing with first, probably the easiest to answer and quickest, and I'll get it out of the way, is the indigenous article. It's 34.2, I believe, of the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances. Again, there's three main conventions, which we're looking at the 1971 convention, which is effectively states, not verbatim here, but that naturally growing substances, which again, indigenous have used for effectively cultural, social, ceremonial purposes, that cultural tradition is protected under the international law, which is effectively why certain countries like Peru, Ecuador, and a handful of others, they effectively have a different attitude and policy under the national patrimony principles for access to these medicines. Now, moving to your second, looking at ayahuasca, for example, or any species of mushrooms which contain psilocybin or psilocin, that'll be interesting, because from my discussions with Paul Stamets, you know, he's informed the TheraCAST litigation team that there's over 6,000 species of naturally wild growing naturally growing mushrooms which contain those substances. And so if you are regulating psilocybin as such, like in Denver, is the big psilocybin movement, well, that's great. But what about psilocin, which is also in these mushrooms? So this hopefully highlights the point that the legislation will have to try to address many issues, but under a unified framework. And that will be difficult in regards to trying to regulate a substance like it's alcohol or tobacco. And the problem with ayahuasca is well, what is ayahuasca? It's a combination of two plants, which there's more varieties of ayahuasca. I mean, it's explained to me like olive oils. If you've ever been to the Mediterranean, you've got, so again, I think you're going to have to regulate probably ayahuasca to a mixed regime of existing CDSA framework, but by the same token, by the same measures that you regulate agricultural products like olive oil, because there's so much of a spectrum.
Right. Well, and that's been our dilemma from day one. I remember my very first meeting in Ottawa with Health Canada with its first department when it formed the MMPR to make this industrial size cannabis scale. And I tried to ask them, you know, help me understand what is your vision? Is medical, because it was only medical back then, is medical cannabis an herb? Is it a food? Is it a medicine? And then, you know, they call it medicine and they call it medical cannabis. So you would think it's medicine. And they go,
even in the title of the act and the regulations, and yet it's nowhere defined in that as a medical plant or a medical substance.
At that time, the Minister of Health, who's long gone now, was very adamant that it wasn't medicine, and because of that, she would not give it a drug identification number, a DIN. And without a DIN, it was difficult to get insurance or any form of coverage for taking the medicine. They had to make a special exemption for veterans.
And not being recognized as a national health or natural health product by the same token. So anyway, sorry, mate.
So,
I just wanted to highlight.
And so the point that I made to them is that we went through very much the same discussion we've just had, though it of course took much longer. And I said to them, it's because it doesn't fit in any of them. You need to make a new category.
Yes.
And in that new category, you can then move a whole class of product into it in a way that can be managed effectively in consistency and coherently.
But that's but let me jump in, because ayahuasca, for example, is not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, you will have different brews, different concentrations, other ingredients included. I mean, this is where it really comes down to developing an understanding and appreciation for ways and traditions which are just not a part of the traditional Western medical traditions in like the global North.
Well, yes,
for example,
yes,
you have,
because I grew up in Alberta where Ralph Klein was premier, and one day he fired everybody in the Liquor Control Board and said, to all the citizens, that's now a private industry. Go grow your own. In other words, make your own alcohol in a single day. Like it happened, it flipped overnight. And we're looking at that like, really? Like, I mean, people do go blind if we're not careful, and obviously we're using the wrong ethanol.
Right. But okay, that's a great example. But the difference is at the moment in Canada, you technically can, the UDV, the Unidos de Vegetales, which is an ayahuasca religion, after 15 years last year, they finally got permission to import the materials. And this is the point I was trying to make is, so what? You can import materials, but what is the experience of the folks that are then mixing the brew? And that, again, comes down to different chacruna, different Banisteriopsis caapi, different concentrations, different plants that are added. I mean, it's 101 different varieties. And ultimately, depending on the experience of the operator will have a much better idea of what are the tools and the compositions that I need for this particular assignment or ceremony. And that's the problem, that I think at the end of the day, assigning too rigorous a description.
Any human consumable product requires, I hate to say it, at some point, some regulation.
I agree, but how do you regulate something that you've got no idea And that's just it. We're going to need major study and research into this, because trying to put a framework and an answer to a scenario that you put it this way, the government and ministers that are in power now, they can't even begin to describe what it is they need to regulate, let alone successfully executing the objective of a successful regulatory framework. Now, if they had this much trouble with cannabis, right, the jury is very much out in terms of how they will handle these next phase challenges. And that's really why I think, to some extent, that the government will require, literally, like the same as cannabis, it will be frog marched towards a line, that imaginary line of what reasonable, dignified patient access looks like, which again brings us into an interesting dichotomy right now, that you have medical access just starting, but yet there is absolutely no commercial, regulatory, retail framework. So it's interesting to see the amount of cannabis companies that have pivoted or are considering operating in this space, which will be interesting to see how many of them actually proceed and have something. And that's where I think, TheraCann, it's an exciting time to be working with a company that was very successful in cannabis with respect to the technology and processes, has been able to do that with respect to regulated food, as well as having the experience of working with over 10 federal governments on consulting and gap analysis, really puts what we're doing and how we're doing it, I think, at an interesting place, which enables us to have these discussions with governments all over the world, let alone in Canada.
Well, it is exciting, and I do really enjoy those discussions, and we try to put it into terms that they understand. And I keep using my coffee as a reference, but when we talk to them about that, these companies are in the coffee business. They're deriving a product directly from the plant to include as much into it out of the plant as they possibly can. They're not just selling caffeine. They're selling coffee. And coffee does have completely different types, whether it's Arabica or whether it's a Colombian, and how it's mixed and how it's blended and how it's prepared. I mean, depending on where you go around the planet, there's no limit on it. But what you want to make sure is, at the end of the day, the product is generally safe, and if anything, traceable. And that's the common denominator that's required. The other challenge that we have is we're not making a new drug. These products have already been out there for thousands of years. They're in the communities already. They're already being cultivated. They're already being consumed. We're not starting from scratch here. And what I find interesting in discussing with most governments is when we provide them with the WHO stats as to the amount that's currently being used in their communities, it's 14, 15, 16% of the community at a minimum is already consuming these products. You say, why are you still supporting that and not allowing industry to get into it and do it better? In my mind, doing it better doesn't mean coming up with a better formulation than the fellow who can do it on his own. Not at all. What I mean by doing it better is doing it in a way that our bank accounts don't get closed. We don't have to hide the product under the sink when a company comes over. And we are able to do this openly and transparently, and share a lot of knowledge openly and not otherwise. So you and I know a bunch of individuals, certainly, that have been in the psilocybin space. They're very successful. They know what they're doing, but they have not been able to get the notoriety. Very much like our early cannabis champions, our warriors, as we used to call them, could not come out into light of day or risk, obviously, getting charged criminally. And once charged, never be able to get a license to do what they dream of doing. So, Rob, we're coming up on the half hour. Just some summary comments. We're at an exciting, pivotal time in industry. And as much as COVID has put such immense pressure on the economy, it's also provided a huge opportunity, especially, as you said, for some licensed producers who may not been quite able to get into their groove for cannabis, may be able to repurpose some of those facilities for these other products. What are your thoughts on that? And in terms of globally, we talked about the UN getting slow, but globally, how do you see this progressing over the next couple of years?
Well, you have effectively the black market, and being a lawyer, I represent clients on, well, all sides of the fence, and the government has to get out in front of this supply issue. If they don't take lessons learned from cannabis, where it was easily about a decade, where they allowed medical patients and operators operating under medical licensing, there were 36,000 at one point, and then the MMPRs were brought in to curb that. Well, if government don't address this and get ahead of a supply sooner rather than later, they are going to effectively have more difficult of a time trying to get the genie back into the lamp than to effectively create a licensing and regulatory scheme that makes sense. And the future is wide open, but as to what the market ends up looking like, well, I can conclude on that the market will be very different than how it looks now. I mean, just look at where we are compared into where we were with cannabis. I mean, if we're in the Section 56 era, we're kind of in even the early days of prairie plant systems, which had the exclusive sole license to produce cannabis through the MMAR period. And effectively, by the time the MMPRs came in, with the advent of the modern LP, well, it's arguable that prairie plant systems as an operation was irrelevant. And that's where I think we're at now. A lot of people are trying to, well, I look at it this way. Talent can hit a target no one else can hit, but genius can hit a target no one else can see. And it's those targets right now that no one else can see is effectively will be the difference between whether or not you're in business in 2 to 5 years from now versus, which is again, success versus failure. And ultimately, a lot of these companies, and the difference is they're figuring it out as they go, but they're figuring out as they go without an established track record and proof of accomplishment. And I think that's what separates the TheraCann team from most of the others in the market at the moment.
Well said, Rob, and thank you for that. All right, well, I'll tell you, we're going to wrap up today's podcast. Thank you very much, Rob. There's going to be a lot of follow-up on this topic over each quarter as we do see it accelerate. For those that are watching out there, we've spoken to quite a host of governments in Central America, South America, Oceania, of course, in Africa that are very much into the game. And of course, there are those countries in Western and Eastern Europe that are already well down the path and ahead of Canada on almost every front. So it'll be interesting to see whether we can get our politicians in line. And for those governments like Canada, in the United States, of course, they're so heavily in debt now. Maybe they would listen to maybe a little voice of reason and start collecting sales money tax on the sale of this product, which is already being sold today. But make it traceable. All right, Rob. Well, thank you so much. Happy Sunday as always. Thank you for your time, and look forward to catching up with you this week.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.
Cheers.
Ciao, ciao.